I know I talk a lot about the expanded college football playoff, but I think it's important because it has such a drastic effect on the rest of the sport. Because everything that you and your team, your university, whatever program you follow, is going to be based off, for the most part, if you are a Power Five, Power Four, and I'll get you to say Power Four eventually. If you're a Power Four fan, everything is based off of, for the most part, how do I get into that dance? How do I get through that exclusive velvet rope? And how do I do it more often? And so I think it's important because that's going to be a gigantic factor for so many different programs year in, year out. And one of the things that I wonder / question about in an expanded college football playoff, especially now that it's grown from 12 to 14 teams, is what that does to regular season scheduling. Because there was a thought process that when the 14 college football playoff came out, that you needed to have another Power Five conference, non-conference, another Power Five non-conference game on your schedule, and that would help you in the college football playoff rankings. Now, I don't know that it ever did. I don't know that anybody ever got in the playoff because they had a better non-conference Power Five game than somebody else, or whatever the case may be. But that was a prevailing thought. And the Big Ten, went as far as to say, hey, we are going to require everybody in the conference to play another Power Five non-conference game. And then if you didn't, we'd have a waiver period. And if some people would try to say, hey, we're going to play Army or Navy or BYU, and the conference either, decided on a case-by-case basis of whether that was going to count as your Power Five game or not. And that doesn't, and I don't think will be a thing going forward. And I just wonder if one of the downsides, one of the detractors is, do we lose some good non-conference games? Because that's been one of the nice things about an expanded college, or I guess the college football playoff when it went to 4 teams, was we got some really good games that turned into quasi college football playoff games during the regular season that we didn't see before. Because in the BCS, in college football, for the most part, kind of has been at its core a sport based on the postseason and how to finagle your standing in the postseason. So in the AP era, in the BCS era, you had to be undefeated, basically. Now you could point to, well, this team, made the national championship game with a loss, yada, yada, yada. Okay, at worst, you had to be undefeated or the best team with 1 loss. Now, when it's going to balloon explosively to 12 teams and then 14 teams, you don't have to worry as much about being 12-0 in theory, right? Because somebody that's 9-3 still has a great chance to make the college football playoff. In fact, you're going to see more 9-3 teams in the college football playoff than 12-0 teams in the college football playoff. But when that gap is so big, when there are so many now spaces available, and I think, and I'll get to why I think this, and I think for some teams, i.e. the Big Ten and the SEC, who have fought so hard and valiantly for guaranteed spots, that if they're not going to get as many guaranteed spots as they wanted, they still believe, hey, we're going to get the benefit of the doubt when it's all said and done. That when push comes to shove and it's time to say, these are the 14 teams making college football playoff, that because our schedules, our conferences are so difficult, we're going to get the benefit of the doubt. Therefore, we don't have to have a non-conference Power 4 game in our non-conference schedules, where the Big 12 and ACC, to have kind of a rebuttal against that from the SEC and Big Ten, I think are going to have to still have big-time games in their non-conference schedules. My fear is you're going to lose out on very good non-conference games. Now, one of the things that makes college football or made college football super interesting was that sort of scarcity that we had before. And what I mean by that is similarly to, like baseball before interleague play started, right? Like the Chicago White Sox and Chicago Cubs were only ever going to play in the World Series. The American League teams play the American League teams, and the National League teams play the National League teams. And the All-Star game was a big deal because outside of the World Series, this was the one time of the year you're going to see these two teams, these two teams of players go at one another. And college football had a similar situation where you were never going to see Notre Dame go to Georgia to play Georgia. You were never going to see LSU go to Texas to play Texas. You were never going to see USC go to Ohio State or Ohio State go to USC, Michigan to Washington, whatever you want to put in there, because they just didn't happen. Is the teams in the Midwest played the Midwest. Teams in the West played the West. Teams in the Southeast played the Southeast. And now, when the college football playoff started, you got to start to see out, and again, that's outside of bowl games, right? That the Rose Bowl, big damn deal, because you're going to see this team from the West play this team from the Midwest, that the only time it's going to happen is on New Year's Day in Pasadena, California. Like, that's the only time you're going to get to see this. So it makes it special. Now, the flip side of that is it got to be really special in the regular season, because when you mandate, hey, we need to play big-time games to, one, help out our TV partners, but then, two, make our college football playoff resume stronger, then you got to see really good and interesting non-conference games. And the sport is better for it when there are big brands playing each other in games you generally wouldn't see. It's undeniable that the sport is better because more eyeballs become enthralled with the games that you're not used to happening, but are happening. Because for 150 years, the objective was your loss column should read 0. And if you can get it to read 0, you are going to be regarded as one of the best teams in America, regardless of your strength of schedule. Now, I'm a big proponent of strength of schedules, poppycock malarkey, dash bull excrement, because you throw Alabama this past season in the Mountain West. Are they not still one of the best teams in the country, regardless of the idea that who you play determines how good you are is a ridiculous thought to me, but that's neither here nor there. You've gotten really good non-conference matchups because everybody in the sport kind of got pulling in the same direction, at least a little bit of like, well, hey, wait a second. This is really good for you. It's really good for me. We get a lot of eyeballs. We get an atmosphere that is similar to one that we are going to participate in the college football playoff going forward. And there's a lot of money to be had. And so we've got everybody kind of moving in that direction. And I just wonder if making a 14-team playoff now disincentivizes playing those games. But I think a 10-2 Big Ten or SEC school is going to be looked at differently than a 9-3 ACC or Big 12. And so your chances of scheduling games, and I like the idea of saying, you know what, we're going to schedule really difficult non-conference games, because even if we lose, we're, one, better for it down the line, and then two, it's not going to be held against us in the college football discussions. The problem is that it always is held against you in the college football playoff discussion. Every loss you have, hell, in some cases, every win you have is held against you. Now, I'm one of the people that will tell you, like, a win is a win is a win. I don't think you can say, well, they hardly beat so-and-so as a, like, detriment to their resume. Oh, they won the game? Who gives a damn how it happened? Like, oh, they only beat Vanderbilt 20-10. Like, okay, well, I don't know how that's a detriment, but every loss is looked at, scrutinized, examined, magnified in the college football playoff. Regardless of whether it's 4 teams or 14 teams, every single loss is going to be looked at and dissected, and there's going to be that autopsy of like, okay, well, wait, how did this happen? How does this affect their candidacy? What does this do to their resume, etc.? And so when you don't have the benefit of the doubt, when you don't have the thought that, hey, because our conference is really strong, that's going to be viewed as like a just, okay, it's one of those things, don't worry about it. So that happens with one loss. If you get to 2 losses, you can't afford a second loss and a second data point to make you look at something and be like, well, the SEC or the ACC and Big 12 aren't just going to have that luxury to explain away a second loss. Fair or unfair? I don't believe it's fair at all, but that's the reality of the situation. And so I wonder what the thought process is for schools in those leagues. Do they say, hey, let's make sure we've got a Power 5 school on the schedule outside of our conference schedule? That way, it's increasing our college football playoff odds. It's increasing our notoriety, our attention, etc. But then also, if you win that game, you've got something really nice to hang your hat on of, we've got an extra data point against a Power 5, Power 4 non-conference game that we can look at and say, hey, we did this as well. So you can kind of hedge your bet, buy a little insurance against your conference strength of schedule on the off year, 2023, that the ACC isn't viewed as being very good. So you can have that like, hey, ACC you didn't think was very good, but we did play, in Florida State's case, LSU, and win that game. So I think that's a nice thing to have in your back pocket. But on the flip side, there are going to be schools that say, I can't afford to have that potential loss on my record because I'm not going to get that benefit of the doubt that other schools might, other leagues might. I can't do it. And so you might see 2 schools in one league, one go 12-0 and one go 10-2, and 10-2 very easily could be the better team, 10-2, or maybe 11-1 and 9-3. And the 11-1 team's lone loss is to the 9-3 school. Well, 11-1 on paper looks better and probably gets a higher seed, etc. But all they're worried about is making the college football playoff. And so their college football schedule sucks because they can't afford to be 10-2, because 10-2 might set you on the outskirts. So I hope that it isn't one of the unintended consequences, because every decision there's unintended consequences that you don't foresee, that you don't think are going to be the thing that makes you go like, or we might have to change that later on down the line. And I'm afraid that's and so I hope and wish there is some sort of guidelines to essentially say, hey, we're going to judge you based off of your 9 Power 4 conference games. So if the SEC has to go to 9 conference games, or they have to stay with a, hey, you're going to have to play somebody. If you're going to do an 8-game conference schedule, you're going to have to play somebody Power 4 in the non-conference. I wish that's the one thing that I think if you could get everybody pulling in that one direction of, at least we're going to operate under these set rules, whether it's 8 conference games, whether it's 9 conference games, I don't necessarily care. It's just that you're kind of arguing 2 really wildly different resumes at the end of the season, where it's not necessarily an apples to apples or even a fair comparison, where the week before Michigan plays Ohio State, Michigan's going to play Penn State, or Michigan's going to play USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington. And the week before Alabama plays Auburn, they're going to play UT Chattanooga. It's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. Now, the SEC rebuttal to that is, well, our conference schedule is so difficult. Therefore, we're only playing 8 games. That's why we play Mercer the Saturday before Thanksgiving. And I don't know which one's right, which one's wrong. I'm sure you could argue both cases, but I do know that at the end of the day, if the Big Ten plays 9 conference games and then requires you to play another out-of-conference Power 4 game, that's 10 games against the best of the best, while the SEC is playing 8. And if my conference loses a couple of games, I went through this earlier in the season on the podcast that the SEC, it's not all that like brilliant of a concept, right? It's not all that ridiculous. They just say, hey, if we play one less conference game than everybody else, there are 7, and now in 2024, that's 8 less losses for our conference in theory. That's 8 guaranteed less losses because you got 16 teams. If you're pitting them against each other one extra time, somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. You take 8 losses off your conference record, it makes your conference look better. But at the end of the day, when it's apples to oranges comparisons, when it boils down to selection time, that sucks. And I don't like it. So I hope there's some guidelines at least of like, hey, here's how we're going to operate going forward, or here's how we're going to judge you. And I don't want to turn it into like a figure skating contest at the Olympics. But at the same time, you got to have some of the similar metrics. It's sort of like, at the end of the day, like if somebody in Major League Baseball hits 56 home runs and then you put the like graph over top of the ballpark of where they hit their home runs, and you're like, if they played anywhere else, they hit 41. It's similar to that of like, yes, you have 4 schools who have won 10 games, but at the same time, last week you were playing FCS schools while this conference was playing teams in the top 25 of FBS. It's a difficult concept to try to equate those two things as like they are equal. A football game was played. Well, yeah, technically, but it's not the same level. And so that's my big hang up is the disparity in schedules. And then does that disparity grow from teams who feel like we've got a pretty good path? Like, for instance, I think Washington doesn't have a Power 5 non-conference game on their schedule until 2029. Like, that's a problem. But do they need that? Do they need that data point? Do they get the benefit of the doubt by being in the Big Ten that, by God, if they just go 9-3, they're going to be in? Probably. So it's just one of those quirks of the sport that I like. A lot of the quirks of college football, but this is just not one that I'm on board with to think like, this is great. It's just not for me. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing. So if you're listening on the podcast, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. If you were watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and make sure you're getting all the great college football content that we're pumping out here on Saturday Glory. I'll see you tomorrow here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory.